Great. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Climate Governance Malaysia CGM Roundtable Series 2025. This series has been going on for the last 2 weeks, and it's a collaborative platform bringing together policymakers, industry leaders, academics, corporate players to crowdsource practical policy reforms for Malaysia's climate transition. CGM first launched this roundtable series in 2022, and it's since become an important convening space for translating discussion into palatable action. This year, Climate Governance Malaysia is running 19 sessions in parallel across 6 themes: biodiversity, agriculture, energy and resources transition, finance, built environment, and community engagement. I want to extend a big thank you before we start to all the partners and subject matter experts who are helping to shape these discussions, and especially to PricewaterhouseCoopers Malaysia, who are supporting CGM in capturing the key outputs and transforming them into actionable policy insights. Today's roundtable, Oversupply and Sprawl, the Hidden Cost of Unsustainable Growth, is being curated and hosted by the Malaysia Green Building Council, malaysiaGBC. Our discussion will unpack how Malaysia's urban sprawl, from rapid deforestation and transportation challenges to ghost developments, intersects with sustainability, market resilience, and community well-being. My name is Mitch Gelber. I'm CEO of MalaysiaGBC, and I'll be helping moderate today's session. Our goal is not only to explore the why behind these trends, but also to identify real implementable policy reforms that can help rebalance growth towards more compact, equitable, and low-carbon urban future. So I'm pleased to be able to introduce our 3 distinguished panelists for this afternoon's session. Yulia Nikulicheva leads research and consultancy at JLL Malaysia, where she brings over 25 years of real estate advisory experience. A member of the Royal Institution of Chartered Surveyors, she helps investors, developers, and tenants make smarter decisions through data-driven insights on strategy, feasibility, and market trends. Richard Baker is PwC's Malaysia's Director of Sustainability and Climate Change. A chartered quantity surveyor and specialist in capital allowances, he advises clients on ESG integration, carbon pricing, and green incentives, and support SMEs in building sustainability capabilities across their entire value chain. And finally, Ian Teh is an award-winning documentary photographer whose work has been featured in National Geographic, The New Yorker, and Bloomberg Business Week. His current project, The Line of Least Resistance, explores themes of urbanization and deforestation in Malaysia. So for this afternoon session, each panelist will start with a 10 to 15-minute presentation, followed by a Q&A and moderated panel discussion. For participants, please use the Q&A box at any time to share your questions for the panelists, and we encourage your feedback. So please, let's make this as interactive as possible. And at the end of the session, a short feedback survey will appear in your Zoom, and your input is greatly appreciated and will help CGM improve these sessions for future years. So with that, I'd like to pass over to our panelists, and the first presentation will be from Yulia. Thanks, Yulia. Take it away.
Thank you very much, Mitch, for this introduction. Let me share my screen first.
Yes, looks good.
Okay, perfect. Okay, let me delve into my presentation. And conscious of time, I decided to focus solely on the office market for Greater Kuala Lumpur, but I believe the same trend would be observed across all other market segments as well. So first of all, this chart this slide shows 2 distinct dynamics. One is the overall stock in Greater Kuala Lumpur, which includes Kuala Lumpur itself and the state of Selangor. And the chart on the right shows the performance of the prime segment. So the prime segment is defined as the best high-rise office buildings, which we track at JLL. So as you can see, the basket which is tracked by JLL is approximately 1/3 of the overall basket. And here we already see quite distinct performance of the overall stock, where with the growing of the office stock, the vacancy rate has been stagnating over the past 4 years at approximately 27-28%. On the contrary, for the prime stock, we see a significant improvement of the vacancy rate performance. So during the COVID, it peaked at around 25%, and now we are down to around 14%. And with the time, we expect the vacancy rate further to improve. So what is the major driver? Why those high quality office buildings are outperforming the rest of the basket? I think this would be the key explanation for the not performing stock and why we have some oversupply. So first of all, let's look at the vacancy rate just for prime space. As you can see, in terms of the green space, it definitely outperforming the rest of the basket. And in spite of the quite significant vacancy rate, which was observed at the end of the COVID, it has dropped from 25% to a remarkable 14%. So this is a very strong performance, showing that green features are very important for tenants these days. At the same time, the chart on the right shows average rental performance. And on this chart, we included the premium buildings, like the top buildings, like those in Terex, or buildings like Binjai, like Petronas Towers, etc. And then we also showed the rest of the market, including green buildings. And again, we see that green buildings, they demonstrate quite significant rental uplift during the past 3 years. At the same time, the Klang Valley all quality stock, according to NAPIC, the rental rate has not changed at all. So again, it shows how important is the quality of the office space, and that we see a distinct performance by quality office stock compared to the rest of the basket. This granular analysis has been performed by JLL to understand what drives this vacancy rate. And it might be a little bit difficult to understand this chart, but it shows basically key things. The overall vacancy is concentrated within a very small basket of assets. So within our basket that we analyze, 20 buildings have vacant occupancy rate below 60%. So these buildings are really suffering from the lower occupancy rate, and the rental rates for such properties are decreasing, while the rest of the basket, 80%, is doing quite well. The vacancy rate is quite strong, and for almost 50% of the properties that we track, the occupancy rate is above 90%, which is very healthy. Is it something unique about Kuala Lumpur that some buildings are suffering, and that the older buildings are not performing as good as new buildings? Actually, as this chart suggests, Kuala Lumpur is positioned quite well in terms of the age of the stock, because quite a lot of the stock has been built in the past, like 20-25 years, compared to some older markets like, for example, Seoul or European markets or American, where the share of the older stock, which requires even more investments, is significantly higher. So basically, landlords in Kuala Lumpur market are facing less of an issue in terms of the office stock, which is aging. And as you can see, vacancy rate for some markets is actually, because of the age of the building, is quite significant. So what are the key issues? Why the older buildings are not performing compared to the new ones? First of all, because typically office buildings, older office buildings have been built more than 25 years ago. They were built for a totally different market. 25 years ago, tenants were occupying less space. They needed just an office space, like compared to current situation when the office space should support company operations and productivity. quite often those buildings would have a low ceiling height, and they have limited number of amenities and other facilities. And as a result, you see that the occupancy rate is very low compared to the new stock, and they also are suffering from the low rents. As a result, this is like a chicken and egg situation, because your vacancy rate is decreasing. The rental rate is also dropping, because when the vacancy rate goes down, usual strategy by the landlord would be to provide a more competitive rental rate, so they will decrease the rental rate. As a result, they are not able to make sufficient investments to improve the building, to add required features. As a result, those buildings are suffering quite significantly. Another things which are quite important for tenants are building specifications like green certification, electricity supply, wide range of amenities, and also nowadays many tenants would prefer to be located next to transit-oriented locations. So this slide summarizes what are the tenants' expectations about the office space. They would like to have lobbies with higher ceiling heights, overall buildings like typical floor plate to have at least 2.8 clear ceiling height, green certification, parking provision, electricity, etc. While landlords in Kuala Lumpur are not able to address those issues set by the tenants. So in terms of the big concerns, of course, as I already showed, increasing vacancy and reducing rental rates are the main pain points for those landlords. And they recognize that this is an issue and something has to be done. On the other hand, payback periods and how they will finance the asset enhancement initiative is a big major issue for them, which they're facing and which stops them from undertaking any significant asset improvement. What we see quite often, the landlords of existing assets are doing in Kuala Lumpur, they are improving the public spaces like lobbies, they installing turnstiles, they may improve the public facilities, parking, they will add a few more F&B offers, green features, landscaping, but they are not doing any major upgrade of the buildings. And we don't see any examples when the building has been converted from office use to, say, hotel, or from hotel to residential. And these kind of stories, they go on and on. We see a lot of buildings with the increase in vacancy rate who are not capable to do major changes just because of the lack of funding and because the lack of initiatives from the government to support this kind of conversion. So as a result, we have this perception of the market that the vacancy rate is quite significant and that the market is oversupply. On the other hand, the tenants, they would be happy to relocate to green spaces because of their corporate policies, because these days, apart from financial reporting, many tenants are also doing ESG reporting, and they have to perform and to report on their progress towards their ESG targets. So this is just a quick overview of the stock which is coming onto the market. Most of these buildings, so overall it's approximately 5 million square feet. Most of them, they will have green features. And so they're recognizing the demand from the tenants, and they would be ready to meet this demand. It's quite noticeable that even a year ago, we had significantly high volume of new projects that were coming in 2027, 2028, but those projects have been canceled because developers recognize that they have not sort of green features, and that's why they might not be as successful as their competitors. Just to summarize, we still need more office space in Malaysia? And this chart definitely says yes, because of the two trends that we observe in Southeast Asia and specifically in Malaysia. First of all, because urbanization is still ongoing, and there'll be more people living in cities in Malaysia. Quite often, people who live in cities, they would require offices or shopping malls or residential. So we would require more residential in those urban areas. And more noticeably, the population growth. We expect to see a quite high population growth in Malaysia. Unlike in many other countries, Malaysia is still a growing population country, and this is another factor which drives demand for residential, retail, and offices. So with that, I would like to finish my presentation and pass to the next speaker.
Thank you, Yulia. That's a great presentation. It's really quite interesting to see the validation of substantial rental premiums for green commercial space in Malaysia. Globally, this is a very well-defined trend, but it's extremely valuable to see the locally derived data and how this is being applied in Malaysia context as well. With that, I think let's pass on to Richard Baker for the next presentation. Thank you, Richard.
Thanks, Mitch, and thanks, Yulia, for that presentation. I'll just share my screen now. I just want to take on actually what Yulia was saying a bit further in terms of the ESG and green agenda and why we do see in a lot of upcoming developments. So first of all, just want a quick overview of actually what we talk about when we say it's ESG, okay? So when we talk about ESG, we talk about environmental. We're talking about the environmental impact that we have, whether that's from climate change, the greenhouse gas emissions, our consumption of resources, but also where are we putting those buildings, whether they're resi, commercial, office. There's a lot of potentially deforestation. There's also biodiversity issues. We've got an issue with waste management and pollution as well. From a social side, we're looking at the people. So Yulia was sharing just now about where people are living, their connectivity, transportation links, but also, statistics do show that people who are working, living in green spaces do generally have a better medical record and a better perception on life as well. The culture and community, as we grow further apart, more distance between us, whether that community is getting more and more dispersed. People from olden times will say, I used to know my neighbor very well. How many of us now know our neighbor in our condominium or our house, right? We're getting more and more disconnected. And then also diversity and inclusivity and the human rights as well, whether that's human rights of ourselves or the workers who are building these buildings as well. And then lastly, talking about governance, looking at shareholders, board structures, ethical standards, and transparency. So that's a general overview of ESG. So when people are talking about why are companies looking into that, these are the main sectors where they're looking into. And why are people now taking on these ESG matters? Well, there's a lot of increased regulation and requirements. So Yulia was sharing just now, there's ESG reporting. So there are some legal requirements now, if you are a certain company of a certain size listed on the stock exchanges, where you need to actually do a sustainability report to share what are your emissions, what are your targets, what is your roadmap. There's also a feel-good factor, right? A lot of times when we're doing something for the community, doing something for good, we get that feeling that it's nice to have and nice to do. And especially in Malaysia, we do have penalties. We do have taxes coming up soon as well, which I'll share later. But there also are incentives and grants. So with everything, there's a stick and a carrot. The stick is the penalties and the taxes that will come in due to these ESG matters. And there's also incentives and grants to hopefully offset some of those CapEx costs to retrofit or to build some of these buildings. And I think, as Mitch was sharing just now, rental rates are increasing. So there is an increase in customer and consumer demand for these products. But actually, most of the stuff we're talking about in ESG is actually just good practice, right? It's normal that we would want to reduce our emissions. It's normal that we would want to reduce our energy consumption and waste. It's just good practice. But this is not something that's new, right? So I've shared on the screen on the right-hand side 2 quotes from Thomas Edison and Henry Ford. You know, these are many, many years ago, where they talked about making sure we use our natural, inexhaustible resources, possible depletion and saving of materials. You know, these are guys from many, many years ago. So it's not this new buzzword that people are talking about. Yes, it's a lot more popular and it's a lot more understood now, but this has been around since, you know, a long time ago. And the reason why we're talking about this, and I don't want to preach too much on this, is that obviously we do know that the emissions are increasing. We do know that we have an issue of climate change, and the tracking to get to our targets is we're falling quite short, right? So based on the last data available from 2023, the global carbon intensity fell by 1%. And to put that into context, to get to our 2-degree increase as a minimum level, we'd have to decrease by 6.9% every year. So we are currently nowhere near where we would want to be in terms of decarbonization. And that's the reason why we do see people looking more into these green and sustainable measures to try to help stop or mitigate as much as we can. And when we talk about emissions, we're talking about greenhouse gas emissions. So this is a term that we normally refer to. It's made up of 4 major gases: carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide, and some other fluorinated gases. And you'll also hear some words about scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3. So I just quickly want to touch on that to explain why, and that will lead into my later slides. So scope 1 is emissions that the company has direct control over, if you like. It's from sources that are owned or controlled by the company. So our buildings, for example, or our company vehicles. There is then scope 2. So this is the emissions that is emitted indirectly, where we purchase electricity or steam or heating. So from that manufacturing process of creating energy, these are the emissions that are released as part of that activity. Not in our control, but we do increase it indirectly by consuming more energy, for example. And then lastly is scope 3, our indirect emissions. So it's part of our value chain. So business travel, waste disposal, employee commuting. Again, we don't really have so much say and so much impact on these, but they are indirectly caused because of our companies. So with all that said, with ESG and greenhouse gas emissions, what actually is the impact here in Malaysia? Now, there's a lot of regulation and there's even more to come in future, but just to share with you a couple that will relate to building specifically, there is the Energy Efficiency and Conservation Act, EECA, where large energy consumers, so this is mostly towards manufacturing, where they use more than 21,600 gigajoules of energy annually, they will need to meet certain targets and certain regulations, energy audit, employee energy manager, energy plan, etc. Now, the key one here that we talked about just now and from Yulia's slide is office buildings. So owners of office buildings with a GFA, gross floor area, of more than 8,000 meters squared will need to get a rating, an energy consumption rating for their building. So an audit will need to be taken. You need to show your tracking of how you're going to reduce your energy consumption and show the benefits. And that label will be attached to the reception or the entrance of the building. So everyone can check the rating of your building. And then lastly, if you're a manufacturer of electrical products, the manufacturer and importer of those need to give a energy rating, and there's a requirement to register those energy ratings as well. So these are, again, it's a law, it's a regulation, and there are provisions in the law for penalties should you not meet those requirements. As I said before, sustainability reporting. So all those listed on the Bursa Stock Exchange or ACE Market will at some point in the future need to do a sustainability reporting. And this is by the reporting requirements. Now you may say, oh, there's not many people on the stock exchange, it's only limited to certain companies, but those companies have supply chains, right? And those companies who are part of that supply chain will need to provide the data to those to report on their emissions as part of their supply chain as well. So you can see it slowly trickles down all the way through to pretty much everyone who's involved. And something that was announced last year and was again reiterated in the budget on Friday, there will be a carbon tax coming in Malaysia. Currently stated to start in 2026 and only on the iron, steel and energy sector. So what this will do is that for all the emissions that are emitted, we don't know the mechanism yet, but based on Singapore, for example, Emissions over a certain cap, they'll have to pay a monetary value for every emission, every ton of emissions over that cap. Now, again, this may only be limited to iron, steel, and energy, but if you think about what do we typically use in construction, we use energy during the construction phase and during the operation. We use iron and steel during the construction, right? So when we're purchasing those as a developer or consuming those as a consumer, the people we're buying off will need to pay a carbon tax, and so they'll likely have to pass on the cost to us. So this will cause an increase for developers constructing, but also for tenants and owners when we have to pay a higher energy price. And the reason why a lot of these companies, foreign nationals here in Malaysia and also in the wider world, there's also their own company targets. So countries do have their own targets. Malaysia has our own net zero target as well. And actually companies in those are linked, will need to show their actions to help those countries meet their targets. There's also pressure from investors. So investors also have a requirement to reduce their emissions and their greenhouse gases. And so they will be pushing it down to their investee companies to say, hey, I need to meet my targets. Can you reduce your emissions and reduce your consumption? And very similarly from banks, they need to show that they're investing in green projects and green funding. And then anyone who is a multinational, their HQ, whether it's from US, Europe, Japan, they will also have their own requirements in their home country. So they'll be passing those down to the companies here in Malaysia to report back to their HQ. So you can see with all this there's a very clear focus and a need for people to have ESG in the back of their mind and they're thinking of when they're making decisions in their business. And how does that relate to buildings, right? So there's two issues why there may seem to be an oversupply in certain buildings. Ourselves as owners, as tenants, as consumers are partly responsible for this, right? So as a company, we may want to reduce our emissions. Maybe even as a consumer, as an individual, we also want to help the environment as well. We make a conscious decision to use public transport, for example, or buy a better building. We want amenities for our employees. We want a nicer building. So we've got a canteen, a staff area, relaxation area, a garden to walk around. Maybe even for residential, we want it for our families. We want to have a gym, an outdoor jogging track, for example, swimming pool. And typically with a green building, the maintenance would be lower as well. There's a newer building. So for a start, that will result in a lower maintenance, but also generally there's a lower maintenance from having green features in your building. And I think also the main one, and maybe the elephant in the room, is the consumerism effect, right? We all want something new. How would the staff feel if we all said to you, oh, we're going to move to a 30-year-old building, right? Wouldn't be taken too well, right? We all want something new, something nice, something flashy. And also we want the building to be in a nice location. Do we want to see a big concrete block next to us? Or do we want to have a nice green park, open space, forest, golf course, right? So all of these are our effect on where these buildings are being placed and being constructed. And then to be fair to the developers, they are just reacting to the market demand, right? The demand is that people want to have a newer, greener space. And as we just showed, the greener spaces can command a premium. So of course, the developers will construct a greener building to attract those customers. What the impact of that is that we have redundant buildings, older buildings that cannot meet these requirements, which will either be lower occupancy, as Yulia was sharing in a slide just now, or maybe cannot be retrofitted to meet the current demands because of costs, because of other restricting factors, right? So it's a very simple, comes down to supply and demand, as with most things. Now, the issue with that is that it's very nice to build a green building. You may say, yes, during operation, a green building is reducing energy consumption, therefore should be reducing the emissions as well by right. But what people are forgetting is that the operational side of a building is just one part of the emissions. There's a huge amount of emissions actually in the construction of the building itself. We call it the embodied carbon in the materials that it's come from, steel, concrete. There's a huge amount of energy consumption in the manufacturing process of those materials. And that emissions is embodied when the building is being constructed. And on a global side, around about 40% of greenhouse gas emissions come from the building and construction sector. So is it right that we build a green building to reduce our emissions and to reduce our energy consumption. And this chart here from the Global Alliance for Buildings and Construction kind of shows the picture here. So the first orange bar is your emissions embodied in the materials and the construction stage. You've then got the smaller blue bars, which are annual operation carbon emissions, and then maybe a smaller renovation somewhere in between. So you can see the majority of the emissions is not actually during the operation of the building, where we typically say, oh, a green building is more efficient, more better for us. It's actually during the construction. So is it right that we shift from an older building to build a whole new building by itself, purely for helping the environment being more green? If you look at this chart, maybe not, right? The emissions are quite heavily in the construction stage here. So if we can't build new buildings because of the emissions and the embodied carbon, what are the other options that we do have? Well, we could always reuse and retrofit the existing buildings that we have, right? Those emissions that were embodied in the construction stage, why don't we maximize that and continue to use the building for longer? If we can retrofit it into a newer purpose, we upgrade it to meet certain green standards, then we can keep reusing that building and not need to build something again new from scratch. And there are actually green rating systems in Malaysia, such as GreenRE, GBI, which do have a rating to allow you to retrofit those buildings. So even though the building originally was not a green building, you can retrofit it to a standard that will get a green rating. And there are also a lot of incentives and grants available. Unfortunately, these grants and incentives are available from a wide variety of agencies and government departments, but they are available to developers, customers, consumers alike. So I'll give you a non-exhaustive list on the right-hand side. There is a GITA, a green incentive available for CapEx you incur to make a building green rated, or if you install renewables, or if you install energy efficient equipment in your building. And there is actually no cap on this incentive, it can run into the millions. And this is currently available until December 2026. Now, it has been around since early 2010s, so it's not something new, but again, it will continue to be updated and refreshed, and the extension will occur. So this one is currently up until December 2026. Now, there's also a normal capital allowances. So certain parts of your building, when you renovate, you retrofit, can qualify again for this, and there's no cap or expiry to that. And then lastly, shared in the budget last Friday, there's also now a modification and conversion of commercial buildings to residential premises. So this is trying to look into what we were sharing just now. Can we reuse the unused commercial buildings and repurpose them as residential? And there's a special tax deduction equivalent to 10% of the qualifying expenses, capped at 10 million. Now, these are just a few examples that I shared with you just now. And this is why I say that we should try to look into retrofitting. I mean, there may be a reason and a rationale to build a new building in a certain location to a certain standard. I'm not saying that's not available to do. But where we do have assets which are stranded or maybe not fully utilized or fully used, can we use some of these incentives to upgrade the building to make it to a certain standard, which will be attractive to new tenants and new customers? At least then we can reuse the building again and really maximize those embodied emissions in the initial construction. And just to lastly finish off my slide, I want to give you a few examples. First one here is REXKL. This has now been repurposed. Originally was a cinema, a very nice job of done by the developers into a very nice place for people to go relax, shop around, eating. There's also the Lee Rubber building, which has now been repurposed into the Else Hotel with a lovely looking, they've maintained the facade, original facade, and redeveloped that into a hotel. And a rather more interesting one is Ames. So this is a data center, and they actually repurposed the KWSP building, which was an office, into an actual data center. So this just shows you that, the possibilities are there. Don't just look at the bricks on the outside and say, this is a commercial building. It's always going to be a commercial building. There are angles, and people have done it before where they've converted into something new, repurposed it, reused it, and still maintained the look, the character, but also made it attractive to investors, tenants, and consumers as well. And with that, I'll end my presentation there. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. It's a great overview of some of the uh, uh, complexity of Malaysian built environment and regulatory measures, the incentives, the regulations, the penalties, and I think the thing that it gives us a good overview of is that it's not a monolithic operating environment. We have our government. Sometimes we think of it as being a singular. We say the government, but when it comes to built environment, we have federal, state, and local policies, which overlap, have different jurisdictions, and are quite diverse. And so the good news is that we're all pushing in the same direction. Where it gets complicated is that we're pushing sometimes in different ways, and the relationship between those different stakeholders gets a little bit complex. With that, let's pass over to Ian and your presentation on the line. Thanks, Ian.
Hi, thank you. Yeah, it's super interesting to hear Yulia and Richard talk about many of the things that I've essentially witnessed on the ground and to see how that is contextualized. So I spent most of my life abroad as a documentary photographer, often covering environmental issues, only to come back and find my home profoundly transformed.
Sorry, Ian, I'm seeing the presentation slide. Is that just me?
Yeah, so that's it. It's just the start. So just
okay, great.
yeah.
Okay, sorry.
No, it's fine. So
your screen isn't full screen.
Is it not full screen?
We're seeing your presentation notes.
Oh, sorry. Let me try again.
It's quite okay.
So it's this. Is that better?
Excellent.
Okay. Sorry. So yeah, as I was saying, I spent most of my life abroad as a documentary photographer, and I was covering many environmental issues while I was out there. And when I came back to Malaysia, and especially to my birthplace in Greater KL, I found it profoundly transformed. So my once green city with its modest roads had become a sprawling metropolis dominated by superhighways. This National Geographic Society supported project is essentially my response to these early observations. And my hope is to amplify the issues and also celebrate the green spaces we have left, to create a snapshot of where we are today and a lasting record for future generations. But ultimately, I want these images to be a catalyst for dialogue between the public and the government. Today, Greater Kuala Lumpur presses against the foothills of the Central Forest Spine. These woodlands at the Klang Gates Dam are part of a contiguous forest stretching north through the peninsula to some of the oldest forests in the world. And the city also stretches all the way to the coastline, home to the country's largest port, which was once an island populated by an old-growth mangrove forest. Mangrove forests protect coastlines from extreme weather, provide livelihoods for fishing communities, and can store up to 4 times more carbon than rainforests. A future deep-sea port is currently planned for the region. And our forests are not just beautiful vistas. They are our heritage and the best defense against climate change. These are flowers fallen from fruiting trees inside a secondary forest in Greater Kuala Lumpur. And many of our green spaces, while still intact, are often threatened. Here, indigenous boys are playing by a river, but their village is near a quarry. We still have small patches of primary forest at the city's outer edges. They're nestled within incredibly biodiverse secondary forests. So imagine scenic spots of natural beauty, rivers with crystal clear waters you can swim in, or roaring waterfalls that you can visit with your family. All of this are just 20 minutes away from the city center. There are not many capitals in the world that have this, especially in Southeast Asia. In many of these pristine areas that we just saw, there's infrastructure build or development nearby, like this highway interchange inside forests east of the city. Our natural green spaces, which are home to many endangered animals, are fragmented. This makes them and the city less resilient to extreme weather. Fragmentation begins with new roads that bring new settlements, which in turn accelerate deforestation. For example, Genting Highlands, which you can see in the top right-hand corner of this image, in the distance has seen a significant uptick in development on its steep hills. Satellite maps show a fanning out of settlements from Greater Kuala Lumpur, as well as at Genting Highlands. Unfortunately, our green spaces are increasingly becoming a privilege for only those who can afford it, when access should be a right. Scientific studies demonstrate that urban green spaces have a significant positive impact, affecting our mood, performance, and even the level of crime. Its societal value, although difficult to quantify, cannot be overstated. The need to protect these green spaces through policy and effective enforcement is increasingly urgent. The subsequent hunger for green spaces is often fed by new developments. Consequently, our city continues to erode our woodlands for land and building materials. Indigenous communities that traditionally live in the forest often lose access to their land unless they have permits. Ironically, quarries were granted access to this same land. Our dreams for a modern society, especially since the mid-80s, have arrived, but at what cost? The forests we had in abundance decades ago are now endangered, and with it is its diminishing ability to keep our urban spaces cool, provide clean air, and mitigate floods. Forest clearing upstream 2 years ago continues to cause heavy sedimentation at the Klang Gates Dam, which you can see in the bottom right of this image, threatening KL's water security. And while you may think that this still looks like an abundant woodland, this is what it looks like from the other side. New settlements erode the existing woodland near the iconic reservoir and mountain range. This river, which normally runs clear, turns murky brown when it rains heavily, due to logging that occurred 2 years ago for infrastructure development upstream. This sediment settles in the Klang Gates Dam, as seen in the previous images. Our forests are our best defense against climate change, helping us mitigate floods and landslides, which, as we know, are happening with increasing severity. Bank Negara Malaysia has highlighted that climate change poses risks to the Malaysian economy by threatening the stability of the financial system. In 2019, BNM estimated over 3 million people were affected by extreme weather, including displacement, injury, and death. To build cities and superhighways, we need resources, and this is where they come from. Here we see the city in the top right-hand corner, the country's largest quarry, and our eastern forest, which is contiguous to the Malaysian Peninsula's central forest spine. And ironically, Selangor has one of the highest numbers of overhung properties in the country. And we often lack buffer zones. The once forested land beside this residential area has been given over for quarrying. Our land use patterns often start with logging, are followed by plantations, and then by development. Here you can see an example of land use transition from forests, plantations, and development in a single photo. What used to lie outside the city is now well within its urban boundaries. The remaining urban green spaces are often on steep hills or wetlands, areas that are difficult and expensive to build on. We have a substantial urban footprint, especially when considering it on a per capita basis. While our Southeast Asian megacity counterparts like Jakarta and Manila are significantly bigger, they also have massive populations. To give you an idea, Greater Jakarta's population is on par with Malaysia's population. This makes our city a fraction of the size of these Southeast Asian megacities. This is also the reason why we still have green spaces to save, but we are at a tipping point. Poor urban planning and failed mega projects accelerate our loss of green spaces. Indigenous communities were resettled when this development started around 2008. Today, it remains unfinished. Residents live next to these diminished properties, which in turn affects the value of their own homes. Our addiction to cars as our primary mode of transport grew out of ambitious economic policies that prioritized the car industry in the mid-80s. We now have more vehicles than people in the country. And new superhighways linking commercial hubs together diminish once vibrant communities by being built too close to them. Like this port town, an elevated highway stands just out of shot, but is only a meter away from the building. Today, it is mostly derelict. Ironically, what we do to our forests, we also do to our communities. This multi-use development of condos and shopping malls has remained under construction for almost 2 decades since the project began. In that time, the original developers went bust, and the construction was recently taken over by a new developer. As our city grew, our existing roads widened. Here, pedestrians have walkways along the main road, but crossing the 6-lane highway without appropriate crossings is a challenge. Over time, the city's highways widened, elevated highways were built, and its relatively young public transportation system was developed. Here, a Hindu temple is hemmed in by roads and a train line. And here, an enterprising villager started a futsal court under the highway. Many of the spaces under and around highways are dead interstitial spaces, not used for anything. This waste of space adds to our urban footprint while decreasing our green spaces. Our rivers have been nicknamed longkams, or drains, in some areas of the city because they are lined with concrete, but they have the potential to be vibrant community spaces. The livability of our city matters. Green and safe spaces offer urban respite while enhancing the health and social fabric of our communities. This is Greater Kuala Lumpur seen from the eastern side. As I flew from the city to the forest in a helicopter with its doors open, I went from feeling warm to experiencing a cool updraft as I crossed into the woodlands below. In that moment, I could quite literally experience for myself the woodland's cooling effect and the clean air it provided as I crossed the line between the city and the forest. Here, one of the oldest highways, a dual carriageway, is now 10 lanes wide. The SPE is the newest elevated highway. Our highways are in many ways modern-day sculptures of how far we have come. The ease and convenience of driving in Greater Kuala Lumpur is greatly facilitated by these massive infrastructures. But it is also one of the key reasons for our rapidly growing urban footprint. We are at a watershed moment. How we move forward will determine the future livability and survival of our city. A recent 2025 global study reported that disconnection with nature had dropped by 60% in the last 2 centuries, primarily due to urbanization and technology. Our economic models externalize nature's contribution to our economy, yet everything we have comes from our environment. Believing we are external to nature is the root cause of the environmental crisis we face today. Tak kenal, maka tak cinta. We can't love what we don't know. I hope to help people rediscover, appreciate, and fall in love with these forests again, while also highlighting the urban issues that contribute to their decline. Thank you.
Thank you, Ian, for the great presentation. I think I want to jump right into some questions. You touched on it a little bit during your presentation, but from your observation, how has car dependency continue to contribute to the erosion of human-scale neighborhoods and community life in Malaysia's urban growth patterns? And what are some possible alternatives that we see around the world that could be applied more intensely here?
I've often seen like big highways cutting through residential neighborhoods, or like areas that are very where you have really communal spaces, and that the fabric of that's kind of disrupted, and sometimes the property values of those places go down as well, and it's happening all over Greater KL. And the thing about roads, or big roads, is that they take up so much space, so they end up just compounding that effect of the city growing. What really caught my interest when I was researching this project was how there are many kind of movements around the world that kind of talk about the 15-minute city. So the concept that you can essentially get your many amenities, facilities, anything from education, relaxation, and work, all within a walking distance. And that if you needed to go further afield, it would be through public transport. And so while the car is still being used, it is not the main form of transport that's inside there. And that actually has a very profound effect in cities that have embodied this kind of idea, or some version of it. They found these kind of cities there's more money being spent on recreation, and the economies in these local areas have improved in these cities as a result of it. So a prime example would be like Portland, Oregon in the US, which came out around the same time as Salt Lake City. So there was a comparison that was done by a guy called Jeff Speck, who's a city planner. And he talked about how those two cities were born around the same time, except the difference is Portland focused on the individual, on the public and people walking around. So one block represented 6 blocks in Salt Lake City. They had skinny streets versus big streets that accommodated lots of cars. All of this meant that it made it easier for people to walk because it was convenient. The same way as it's convenient for us to jump into a car, it is now convenient for us to, take a step out the door and walk. And that has a huge difference on the community.
Yeah, there's a certain amount of frustration that I feel, having been born and raised in North America. A lot of the lessons we learned from the 20th century about the impact of cars on cities in North America and in the US in particular, the US is now spending tens and hundreds of billions of dollars to take down these highways because of the damage they do to communities, because of how they fragment and balkanize. They cut neighborhoods apart from one another. And in Malaysia, we're in the process of carving up the city in much the same way and doing that damage from scratch. So there's definitely a certain amount of frustration involved in that. The other part, you mentioned the study about Portland and Salt Lake City. There's great traffic analysis that comes out of LA, which is that there's no amount, when we talk about congestion and traffic, there's no amount of new building of highways that can alleviate traffic. You can widen a road to be 20 lanes, and the cars will fill all 20 lanes. As soon as you widen a road, it sucks in traffic from other roads and other neighborhoods, and the net impact on traffic flow is zero. The only way to actually solve congestion and traffic jams is by getting people out of their cars, walking, public transit, and reducing the number of cars in particular. So this is something that we have the benefit of these global examples. So the hope is that these are lessons that we can learn more quickly because of the failures in other places. Go ahead.
I just want to say I have an anecdote for the LA thing that you mentioned, because in my research about on forums about images of LA being chock-a-block with traffic, there's always comments down at the bottom that says just one more lane. And I was looking at Damansara Perdana area as well, and there's a really complicated spaghetti junction around there. And literally that same comment just one more lane, bro. Just one more lane was just literally, you know, LA, Kuala Lumpur. It's just crazy.
Yeah. It's a solution. It's counterintuitive because it feels like more roads should be alleviate traffic, but it's just the opposite. It's doubling down on failed solutions and failed systems, or systems that have their own inherent limitations. I think I want to pivot now to Yulia. From a market perspective, where do you see Malaysia's oversupply pressures being most acute? And I want to rope in one of the questions from the audience here. There are a lot of commercial pressures that come from the way that we develop short-term investment, people using property as investment, both companies and individuals. So where do you see those pressures being most acute, and what are some possible solutions that we can look at?
Yes, thank you very much. That's a very good question. And I think there are two major sides of the story. One is that if you look at the oversupply, especially in commercial space, most of that would be for the older buildings that have been built 20, 30 years ago, and that has not been properly maintained, or they have not been upgraded. So those buildings will not have ESG features, as Richard mentioned. Many tenants now, they have a corporate policy to report on the ESG. They have to take green spaces. And as a result, these buildings with no green features, they are losing the tenants. The other aspect would be the maintenance, because historically, and I think I would agree with the person who asked this question about short-term view of the investors, they have not put enough investments into maintaining the property, into like upgrading facility management and doing proper investments for future upgrade of the systems. As a result, after 10 or 15 years, those properties may already start losing the value, which should not happen in any other circumstances. So I think there should be some kind of regulation for landlords to allocate certain amounts of money on like future building upgrade. At the moment, it's all up to the landlord if the landlord decides whether to keep some money on the accounts or not. And majority of landlords, they actually just spend the money. I mean, they get the rental and they spend everything, or they just take it as a profit. So as a result, in 20 years' time, when the building would require some upgrade, they don't have any money to invest to improve the property, and we are facing this kind of situation. So I guess some kind of government regulation on this, imposing the landlords to make certain like investments for the future would be quite beneficial for the market and make it more healthy.
Yeah, I think I'll pivot maybe to Richard. There's a question in the chat. There have been proposals for a vacancy tax for unused properties, like in countries like Australia. Is this something that could be made practical in Malaysia, incentivizing the use of existing building stock?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really good point and something that could be considered. Just need to be careful of being fair to everyone, right? There may be a reason why some buildings are vacant, that maybe outside their control. For example, they have no money to retrofit and make the building nice again, right? But I think with some caveats and some clauses, that would be a reasonable thing to do. To show you an example, in UK, we have used to have BPRA, which is a business premises renovation allowance. So they identified certain postcodes, certain districts that were more derelict, I would say, more in use, and they actually prioritized the investments and funding to that area to uplift and upscale that area as well, whether that's continuing the current use or making reuse of it as well. So there are opportunities for taxes, for grants, for incentives to come into place to help that. I will be careful of siding on the side of penalizing people for vacancy. It may generally be sometimes out of their control to have it vacant, But I think where something is a new development, within the last 5 years, there's no reason for that building to be vacant, right? It should have been built with a good business case behind it, with a market demand. There's a rationale behind it. If something is an older building, let's say 20 or 30 years, maybe it's run its course and people have moved on from that area, I think that should be given some dispensation because there may be a genuine reason why. But for a newer building, I fully agree with what the person was saying. There should be some repercussion for that being vacant because it's obviously was not done for the right reasons, perhaps, or in the right area, or with the demand, and it was purely a speculative thing for short-term investment, like you just mentioned just now. Yeah.
Yeah, I think Ian mentioned during his presentation that there's a part of this is about mindset change because there's a proven track record, a process of deforestation, plantation, and then development, commercial development on that land. And you hear it's something, a term that I only heard once I came to Malaysia was land bank. The idea that the value, that the land has some inherent value for speculative investment based on this sense that the future of the country is development. And what development means is construction. And the missing part of that equation that tends to throw some gasoline onto the problem is that the value of the land comes from the use, not from that speculative floor area. If the building isn't being used or there isn't a demand for that use other than from an investment vehicle, the repercussions and the impact on society are tremendous. And this is something that we all are going to be paying for, and our children are going to be paying for, years into the future. So, we've had a rapid period of urbanization. We've had a rapid period of development, but it's really vital that we increasingly regulate, so we prioritize quality over quantity, that we prioritize value that includes, puts a higher premium on human inhabitation rather than economic, at the expense of where human habitation becomes a liability of economic expansion. So I think there's another question. I'll open this up to all three about there are very few sidewalks and pavements in Malaysia. We used to have the 5-foot way, which used not to be blocked. Are there any proposals to bring this in for new developments? I'll throw this to the group. I have an answer in the hopper, but anyone want to take a shot at this?
Because when we work on master plans for larger projects, developers are now conscious of this trend, and they are trying to incorporate some more working friendly environment into the developments. But overall, the city, yes, I think the city still lacks sufficient number of working pathways which would be convenient. So maybe something for the DBKL to think of.
Yeah, I'll go ahead, Richard.
Okay, a lot of the issue is that we do have pathways, but they're usually not in usable format, right? So they're blocked by something. People use it to park there. The maintenance is not quite there, so the pathway is rocky. So I think also it's not just providing it as well, but making it actually be used as a walkway and a pathway for people to actually physically walk down, right? So making sure developers are accountable for the maintenance of it, making sure DBKL or whoever the government is to say that make sure it's policed, policed, and it's correctly used as well is also another factor. I think those are quite important things, not just about developers putting it there, but can we actually use that walkable space as well?
I think what I was going to add on to that as well is transportation between 2 points requires coordination between those 2 points. And one of the things that we struggle with in our city is that coordination. Ian and I were attended an event 2 weeks ago or 3 weeks ago that's being a project that's being done by Malaysia Nature Society, looking at the interconnectedness of green spaces in the Klang Valley. And from an ecological standpoint, the continuity of natural spaces is critical for animals to migrate between spaces, for plant species to have intact landscapes where organisms can move without obstruction from one part of one land to another. Humans are part of that natural ecosystem. And so the ability of humans to move seamlessly from one neighborhood to another, from one building to another, it's not something we can just take for granted. That requires communication, coordination, and there's a lot of benefits and a lot of value to our diversity. This is one of the biggest challenges because, DBKL doesn't control the land that KL sits on. That's a state and federal. So each government entity has their own silo, their own viewpoint, and they don't necessarily, it's challenging to communicate and coordinate between different entities cutting across the board. I think I want to pivot now to Richard. You talked a little bit about incentives. Malaysia's development model often equates progress with construction. You touched on some incentive schemes, tax breaks, carbon pricing, ESG-linked approvals. What are, if you had to name one that you have the most, one or two that you have the most, you think have the most potential for incentivizing more compact, low carbon urban forms, what do you think those one or two incentives would be?
Yeah, so I think I touched on just now with the retrofitting and the business premises one. So I think that's definitely one that we need to look at. There's far too many older stock buildings which are not fully utilized. And ignoring the point I mentioned just now about the carbon emissions in the building, right? Even if one tenant is in that building, the building needs to be fully operational, right? So it's consuming energy regardless if there's one person or 100 people inside there, right? From a health and safety perspective, the lifts need to work, the lights need to be on, and the aircon generally will, in an older building, will be a centralized system. So the aircon is running full blast for the whole building, right? Even if there's only one tenant inside there. So I think that's definitely one, because that will reduce our emissions quite substantially if we can reuse these buildings that are pretty much all vacant. I think the other key one here is, and something that our neighbors in Singapore, UK do quite well, is actually linking the green to the actual planning permission itself. So before we even get to the construction stage, right, there needs to be some requirements and some policy in place that to get this planning approval, to get a certain approval to go and build that building, there needs to be some credentials inside there, right? So is there a business study done? Is there a market study done to show that there's actual requirement for this building inside here, right? Have you linked into your public transportation systems? And maybe to incentivize on the opposite side of it, we maybe give the developers to say, I think in Singapore, they give a better plot to height ratio if you build a building of a certain size and a certain energy efficiency and certain green features. So I think that policy of making a planning requirement linked to these ESG green credentials before we even get to the stage of construction, I think will solve a lot of those problems as well.
The irony is that we do have that in our planning approval. We have provisions, mandatory requirements put on developers for green space allocation at ground. The challenge becomes, many of our developments have internal ring roads. So we do have green space requirements. We do have planning regulations for individual buildings. It's that coordination between buildings and neighborhoods and parts of the city that really the cracks start to open up in the way that our governance. I mean, Malaysia is, when we look internationally, Malaysia has tremendously rigorous building codes, planning permission processes, but what we also have are overlapping jurisdictions, a delicate balance of governments working together, and gaps open up between that. We don't all pull together in the same direction, and we do that, but sometimes that's to our benefit, and sometimes that has liabilities as well. I wanted to address the next next question to Yulia, and it's really a question that has to do with equity. You pointed out in your presentation that when we look at oversupply in commercial property, it's not equitably distributed, and the same thing is true for residential sector. Many of our cities have a huge oversupply of high-end units and yet an undersupply in affordable, well-located housing. So in your view, what are some of the market practices that drive or exacerbate this imbalance? And what can some data do? Is there data available that might help us address some of this imbalance?
Well, I think the oversupply issue in residential is linked to a few things. First of all, COVID pandemic, because during the COVID we had quite weak residential sales. At the same time, the developers have been completing quite a substantial amount of projects. So as a result, the amount of unsold units after COVID have been just plummeting, going up significantly. It's actually now going better, but still certain locations, they face an issue of oversupply. And I think one of the key reasons for that is actually, Richard pointed out, is some proper planning and some more governance from the government itself, because they probably need not just to give a permission to build anything, but they should probably require some kind of feasibility study to be done prior the project is launched. The banks should also be watching more carefully those projects which are proposed, because quite often what we see that some really huge projects are built in wrong places where there is no demand, or they are trying to target certain categories of buyers who will never consider this kind of location. So some better planning and governance would probably help to improve on the situation. Okay.
Thank you for that. There's a question in the chat about public transportation being used to reduce car dependency, and how that might be how that can be applicable for different populations. The question talks specifically about elderly. Is public transportation, are public transportations applicable to all communities and all populations? And I think, you know, I'll take a first shot at it. It's I mean, the easy answer is they absolutely can be. I mean, there's cities throughout the world that have public transportation that is accessible, universally accessible. It has to be designed as such from the outset. And again, in Malaysia, we've taken big strides in increasing our public transportation in recent years. But a lot of the infrastructure that we have is not perfect. There are gaps, there are shortcomings. If your train is elevated 50 meters up in the air, that reduces the amount, the catchment area of walkability that transit plugs into. When we talk about transit-oriented design, a lot of those calculations are premised on a horizontal plane. And what we've been building our transit infrastructure with MRT up in the air. So absolutely, it's a great question. Needs to be sensitive for it to be scalable and for it to be applicable to the widest population possible. Does anyone have anything to add to this?
Yeah.
Okay, go ahead.
Ian, go ahead.
Yeah, so I think, Mitch, you mentioned a little bit about this before, but I think, you know, speaking from personal experience, I usually end up driving and picking up my wife from the MRT or from work, because basically the last mile and the first mile is never very convenient or not necessarily always very safe at certain times. And I think that plays a big part for it. And so I think that would be something that really needs to be addressed if that's to change.
And to go back to the previous question about the 5-foot way, you know, we have we're not reinventing the wheel here. We have effective urban solutions for how to pedestrianize neighborhoods in our tropical environment that are shaded, that have comfort conditions, where we're protected from the rain, and we've undone a lot of that. So you look to Singapore to the south, or you know, Malaysian cities like Georgetown, certain small areas of Malacca, where and even in KL, where we have some of that older urban fabric still intact, the city can be very walkable. It's about what's happened in the intervening years. We've turned away from that. We see, and a lot of it comes down to mindset. If we see value in a highway, the progress is a highway, we're going to be predisposed to build more highways. If we see value in a community where we have multi-generations being able to walk their children to school, or pick up your wife from the bus stop on foot and go out to dinner, the quality of life can be higher. It's not necessarily one direction or another, but as long as we see value in a mega highway where maybe none exists, or we're not seeing the repercussions, then we're going to keep on privileging ideas that have liability down the road, and sometimes not even that far down the road. I think there's another question in the chat. How about levies on developers to fund green space, and a requirement for a percentage of green space wherever developments are approved? Also, an incentivizing of brownfield sites instead of greenfield sites through fiscal means. So I think let's focus on the second part of that. We already do have structural plans that have minimum requirements for green space. There's a separate issue, which is that when it's developer driven, it tends to become private green space. So let's leave that to a side, though. A lot of this comes down to, how do we value adaptive reuse? How can we incentivize and build value in redeveloping brownfield, redeveloping our current neighborhoods, rather than pushing out further and further into hinterland? Does anyone want to take a first stab?
I think I maybe can start, because JLL Global Research just published this summer a new research together with The Economist on how the cities are approaching this issue of retrofitting the older stock. And they have interviewed the key marketplace, like the government, developers, investors. And the key finding is actually the whole process of developing the brownfield should be led by the government and the policy. Because without policy in place which will prioritize brownfield development over greenfield development, no one will actually tackle this kind of project, because it's much easier to take an empty land plot and develop a new building from scratch. Because we all know that doing the brownfield development, it's more expensive, it's more challenging, because you need to put more thought and more investments into the building systems and changing the layouts of the building to accommodate it to the new use. So some special programs which will prioritize these brownfield developments would be required, so that developers would take a different look at this existing stock and will pursue those projects. That's the market perspective.
Yeah, I think it's a good point, and that needs to also be clarified. It's not necessarily that the construction is more expensive. It's that if you take a land which is on the outskirts and is cheaper, or been stored away in a bank, and you create you develop it, you're creating value from high value from low value. Yep. The actual construction cost is not the limiting factor. It's that in the absence of regulation, in the absence of tighter land use policy, that greenfield site gives you potential for higher returns.
And it's much faster, because you don't need it's just straightforward project. You just put your tower or whatever you're building on a green site, and you can launch the construction.
I mean, just to share as well, there are some principles to this. So from a different perspective, but when TRX came up, for example, to try to entice people to go there were certain allowances for relocation, for renovation, for people moving there, right? So why can't we use those existing ones for retrofitting buildings, right? Can we provide grants to the tenants, to the landlords to allow them to have a rent-free period or a lower rental to start with, or some relocation allowances. Because I think once we get people moving to those buildings in those areas, it's kind of a bit like self-fulfilling in that the rest of the space will then continue to grow because more people move into that area, right? So it's again trying to create the demand by having a few people there. You know, when people construct the mall, they have an anchor tenant to try to attract people inside there, right? So can we develop one particular building in an area, and then hopefully that will build up the area and people will realize, hey, this is not such a bad place. We've got food areas, we've got walkable space, we can get to the MRT very easily. And then that will hopefully spur on the development to the wider area of those buildings as well.
Yeah, I think, I mean, we do have, you know, Richard, in your presentation, you showed just a few examples. We have more than a handful of examples of really amazing adaptive reuse, not just in KL, but in different cities throughout Malaysia, of breathing new life into older neighborhoods. There's a lot of potential. It's really, it becomes a lot about where do we see value, and how the good news in this conversation is that where we see value isn't fixed. It changes. We're not, you know, one of the challenges we have as humans is that we think that it's easy to think that the solutions and the problems that exist today are the solutions and the problems that will exist a few years down the line. But the way we live, the way we view our environments is transitions. It's fluid. So I think a lot of this conversation is also about encouraging, incentivizing through public policy, through policy incentives, growing awareness of where this potential lies in a better way to develop our city, not just out, but denser, more valuable. Go ahead, Ian. I saw you.
Yeah, I was going to say that what you're saying is that I also think that in Malaysia, especially in Greater Kuala Lumpur, we're habituated to drive. So because of that, we kind of instantly see the car as something that gives us access to freedom and kind of convenience, which is very true. But there's this huge infrastructure build that allowed that to happen. But in our habituation, it actually makes it hard. And this is also true about other cities who are very car centric, that they can't sometimes, they're kind of blinkered and they don't see other alternatives. So one example I would take is like maybe in Seoul, the mayor converted a highway. I can't remember what it was, but into like a communal space for walking. And over time, you know, there was obviously at the beginning it was kind of seen as a big inconvenience, but over time they realized that that's what they wanted it to be, because it created so much, you know, and it created this public space that people started to see value in it. And I think that examples around other parts of the world as well, that where, you know, old railway tracks like in New York was converted to like a walk path. But the interesting thing I also want to add is just that cities that are walkable, those roads tend to have less accidents. Yeah. Cities that are designed for the car and have wider roads, they tend to have more accidents. And there's a correlation with obesity or like, you know, fitness levels of the population. And interestingly, when I was looking at that in the US, but also then started speaking to people who are collecting data here, there was a correlation that Malaysia's obesity rates started to spike around the mid-80s. We can't say it's an exact cause, but that was also around the time when we started to become increasingly car dependent as well.
Yeah, it's you know, quality of life is a tricky animal. But the car opens up some possibilities, but it shuts the door on others. And you know, by connecting our progress as a country to industrial production, industrial transportation infrastructure at the expense of walkability, of cycling infrastructure, of motorbike, it takes the country in a very specific way, has a lot of infrastructure, societal, not just environmental, but health repercussions as well. I think we're coming to the end of our time. I wanted to go around the table and give everyone the opportunity to put forward one immediate and one long-term reform that could help stabilize Malaysia's property market and some of the development issues and oversupply issues we've been discussing this afternoon. So maybe Yulia, we'll start with you.
Yeah, sure. So in terms of immediate measures, I think the government has already done quite a lot of steps in order to stimulate green development and green supply. So the policies are already in place. It's just probably executing them and like streamlining the execution would be required. In terms of the long-term policies, I think to avoid the oversupply, the government has to make like more prudent policy in terms of the new incoming supply. As I said, something like feasibility studies before giving the permission to construct, and also some policies that would impose requirements for the landlords of existing buildings to accumulate certain funds to improve the buildings in the future. And that I think would be quite helpful.
I think, Richard, should we go to you?
Yeah, sure. So short term, I think those like similar to what Yulia was saying actually, but more for the incentives and grants. So there are incentives and grants available. I think the advertising and the marketing of it needs to be more improved. So making people aware these things are available when they're looking to decide whether I should go and invest in a new building or retrofit an existing building. So that's a short term one. In terms of a long term, I think with the carbon tax and a lot of these levies and penalties coming in, looking into how we can reuse those, right? So should that fund be congregated and used as a grant or an incentive for passing down to our people as well? Maybe we should use it ourselves to go and invest in developing more greener spaces, for example. So what is the purpose of that collection of funds and how it should be used? I think is a more long-term look going forward.
For me, the example I would take is actually London. And creating a green belt around the city that's fixed. I feel like we've got protections within for our green spaces, but there's often too many loopholes, and that's probably because of the different jurisdictions that different government bodies have. But I think if we can actually solidify that and make that a thing, this will in turn then mean that investment and money will go into things like retrofitting, which means that will regenerate communities, etc. That means that rather than trying to create a new space and a new kind of social community fabric that's in a new green space area that used to be green space, it will mean that we have to reinvest and refurbish these existing urban spaces already. So that just by literally cutting off the supply of green spaces for development and other types of licenses that can be used, we force businesses and government and the general public to find ways of improving what we already have. And I think that would be super important.
Yeah, I think it is really about shifting priorities. That economic development is really critical to evaluate where is the value. The value in our built environments is in the lives of the people who occupy them. We're not designing an industrial process. We need to do a better job of evaluating, putting the value in human and natural systems that are for the benefit of the humans that occupy the space. So I think with that, we're going to bring this afternoon's conversation to a close. I want to extend a special thanks to all of our speakers, Yulia, Richard, and Ian, and to all our participants for questions in the discussion box. A special thanks to CGM and PwC Malaysia for driving this initiative. And please remember to complete the post-session feedback form And stay tuned for more of these sessions throughout the month of October. So with that, thank you all, and we'll bring this afternoon's conversation to a close.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.